So a thing that a lot of people probably know about Kings is this terrifying story that for the start of the Christmas Carol services, you just get the tap on the shoulder just before the red light goes on and you're off. And I think that's actually true rather than just being an urban legend. How far does that go with other solos? Obviously, there's the bit in Ireland's Greater Love on this recording. In a service, would you do that for that kind of thing, or
No. The only reason for doing that on Christmas Eve is to stop both the boy and perhaps even more so the boy's parents becoming anxious. So, you know, 3 or 4 kids will be auditioned on Christmas Eve, and then I'll have a fairly clear idea in my head at lunchtime. And in fact, it's not so much a tap on the shoulder as it is just pointing to whichever child to step forward. But then in the normal course of events, no, I would always make sure that there's more than one person ready for any solo. So some of the solos on this recording, there would have been 2 or 3 people ready. One as the sort of likely contender, but a couple of
understudies maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly that. I mean, that's sort of common sense as much as it takes the pressure off the boys, and it also avoids. I'm always keen to avoid this idea that there might be 1 or 2 boys who are always the soloists.
Yeah, I was going to say. So presumably you'd have certain solos that often come up. You'd have in your mind sort of whether that's one with a head chorister or a newer or someone in the middle.
Yeah, and I think it's a mistake. If I have a really good boy, I think it's a mistake to rely on him for the majority of the solos, because I've also got to be nurturing the next generation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So even if that means using perhaps not quite the best at your disposal, it's the educational side of it. You've got to keep that going as well.
Got to keep that going. And there are also different types of repertoire. I mean, a lot of the English Tudor verse services, all those sorts of things that we do during the term that we might not necessarily put in a concert or in a recording, they're slightly less public, they're less high profile, and there's a chance for a child maybe to not do it perfectly, but to learn from that experience. It's not always the case that a soloist always, drops the mic every time.
So most of the repertoire on this recording is fairly popular, fairly well-known things that people are going to know and love. One thing that jumped out at me, and I didn't read the track list properly, when it got to the Lossy, I thought, oh, and then I looked at the track list again, which I think a lot of people will, and saw that you've done the 6-part rather than the very well-known 8-part. Why did you do it that way? Is that your normal one that you would go to in liturgical use, or?
No. Well, the genesis of this disc was really around the television program that we make called Different Kings. And in COVID, in December 2020, when that TV show was to be filmed, we actually had COVID in the back row, and we had to stand down our choral scholars, and we brought the King singers in. So we made this CD to try and capitalize on the work that we'd done that we then couldn't follow through with the filming. So one of the decisions would have been with the television editors when that program was being planned, to try and do something that might not necessarily be all the old favorites, but also might not necessarily be completely unknown to people.
Yes, it's quite a nice balance. And it's quite musically similar, actually. You can hear it's kind of the same guy doing the same things, similar things.
Yeah, it's the same little box of tricks, really, around the same text. Why did I choose the 6-part? I just thought, Kings has done the famous 8-part one many times. It was something that we hadn't done, so I thought there was enough novelty, but also coupled with some familiarity.
Yeah, it's a fab piece. You obviously have this very well-known thing of, again, at the Christmas service, using these descants that people know and love and all that kind of thing. And it's a key part of Christmas for a lot of people, but I was quite surprised at the use of them on some of the hymns you've included here, some of the Good Friday things that are they're quite moving hymns rather than straightforwardly celebratory. Would that be what you do in the normal way of things? Would you use them fairly constantly throughout the church year?
Well, it's interesting. These specifically Passiontide hymns on this, we've actually been talking about it only last week when we finalized the liturgies for Holy Week here at King's. I suppose it's a mistake to think of a descant as being just a sort of crowd pleaser at Christmas. And as you say, that they are quite moving. And I think liturgically they can work extremely well, even when the season itself is penitential and meant to be a little bit more low-key. I do remember when, before coming to King's, when I worked at St. Thomas, Fifth Avenue, the Holy Week liturgies there were extraordinarily elaborate. And
Really?
these descants, some of them I brought with me from there and others I found, but they did work rather well because they give a different sense. They're not like the end of the Christmas carol service. And of course, I think the secret to a good descant is to have a good tune to begin with, the thing that you are descanting. And some of these Easter hymns, I think, are extremely powerful and don't need a descant. So if they're going to have a descant, it has to add something.
Yeah. It's funny you should mention St. Thomas, because actually the next thing I was going to say is you've included this work by T. Frederick Candlin.
Oh yes, yeah. Glory.
And I know you've mentioned in the past being quite keen to reach out to the American, I suppose, fan base, you'd say crudely, the huge number of Americans that really, love and appreciate the King's tradition. Is that another little bit of transatlantic nod?
I suppose it is. I mean, it's the Candlin piece is not. It's not an Elgar symphony, but it's still worth hearing. And I suppose there is a little nod in that. It's a hymn anthem, so it's a tune that people would recognise. I think as you say, King's has this extraordinary exposure in the States, and that comes from the Christmas broadcast. I mean, the Christmas Eve service is taken by over 400 radio stations across the US. So our interest does come a lot from that. But I think there's always repertoire for us to discover. And this is just one of a handful of things that I brought with me in my case, and just thought it would sound rather good in that chapel with that organ and that choir.
So speaking of the organ, what I suppose you'd call the closing voluntary on the album is this Duruflé transcription of Tournemire.
Tournemire.
One is his sort of chant-based improvisations. And as I understand it, Tournemire himself didn't write any of these things down. I'm like, how did Duruflé manage to get hold of them and then, preserve them for posterity?
Tournemire, things that he did write included a cycle of chant-based compositions for the entire liturgical year. So, I mean, like so many French organists, he was, if you like, born out of improvisation. And I think he must have been recorded whilst improvising.
Oh, yes. I was wondering whether the technology would have let them do that at the time.
Yeah, it would have.
That makes it much more straightforward, I suppose. You can then just
probably been quite a sort of mono recording, but Duruflé transcribed, I think, 5 of these. This is one, and in the same way that people have, I mean, David Briggs, famous former King's organ scholar, transcribed a whole load of improvisations by Pierre Cochereau at Notre Dame. There is a kind of culture of learning your craft from transcribing these things.
Yes, there's a chap I used to work with who said the same was true of people wanting to start out on jazz, to listen to some of the really good stuff, write it out and see how it works.
Yeah. Play around with the notes on the page. And I mean, you can see that Duruflé obviously learned a lot from doing that, and was himself a very fine improviser.
So quite apart from that Tournemire, which is obviously an improvisation on Victime Pascali, there's plenty of other stuff on this album that's sort of got some link to plainsong. And it's obviously a very important bit of the sort of musical heritage of the whole Western Church. How much do you use plainsong, literally plainsong itself, as opposed to things based on it, in your sort of year's worth of liturgy at King's?
Well, it's actually something that Stephen Clearbury introduced a lot of when he came to King's from Westminster Cathedral. So if you come to King's on a regular Sunday during term time, you will hear all the propers of the Mass, so the texts specific to that day. you will hear them sung to chant in Latin, which is kind of unusual because the rest of the service is not particularly Catholic, let's say. It's quite regular Anglican. So that's quite a nice sort of hybrid. Why did he do that? Well, I suppose there was an educational aspect to it, but also, I mean, it's such beautiful music, which it just wafts around our building, and I'm fascinated by chant, and I suppose I've introduced a little bit more of it since coming. So whilst maintaining what Stephen introduced, we've also done things during Lent. We've sung a lot of chant, which means I've been able to teach the children how to read it, because obviously the notation is different. But the main reason for doing it, in my mind, is that it teaches a really keen sense of line. You know, you're always wanting your choirs to sing with a sustained line. And in a building like King's, it's very easy to rely on the acoustic to kind of provide that for you. And of course, with chant, a single line, you can't rely on the building. So it's been both a sort of creative and an educational endeavor, really, which seems to be going down well.
Do you find it has, knock-on benefits then in the way the choir sings other music? Yeah,
I think it's, I mean, it's an educational tool, not just for the children, but also for the adults, because they are themselves undergraduates. Some of them come with quite a bit of experience, some of them not as much.
Yeah, indeed.
So it really is a training that's very valuable.
Just finally, I was listening back the other day to the Centenary album, which I think was 2018, and it's got all those archive recordings going back to, I think, the mid-70s, with really quite drastically different sounds in the choir back in different eras. And it goes from sort of quite delicate touch to a more full-throated sound. Have you yourself got a sort of vision for the sound you'd want the choir to have in that sense?
Well, it's always a sort of a tricky subject, this, because people have this idea that there is the King's sound. And it's predicated on the idea that what Wilcox was doing when recordings became more commonplace, that's the King's sound. But of course,
but that's now quite a few decades.
Yeah, but that's the point. If you were to compare some of the Wilcox recordings with, say, some Ledger recordings, they sound quite different. If you were to compare early Clearbury with later Clearbury, the sound changes. So I think there is a sound which is, if you like, linked to the building and the fabric, the sound of the chapel. I think the sound of the choir does change. It kind of develops. It changes depending on who's in it and who's directing it. But I think my concept of sound is also based on what sort of music we're singing at a given time. So I quite like to investigate and play around with different sounds for Schutz than say Lennox Berkeley,
So there might not be like one King's sound for you, then there'd be sort of an early sound and then a sort of big Victoriana.
Yeah, I think there's, I could get shot for saying it, but I think my concept is perhaps different from maybe some of my predecessors, but also some of the people who, if you like, subscribe to the King's sound. That for me, the enjoyment is finding different sounds for different styles of music, and it all comes out of what the music itself suggests and how that sound can give the color of the language and the sonorities of the music that are kind of there prompted by the words. So I try to go for a broad palette of colors that might be different depending on the repertoire. But then you kind of also, it depends who you've got in the choir.
Yes, of course. You're sort of slightly shaped by what voices you've got and what they're like.
Yeah, and our back row, our adult members, of course, they are earlier on in their careers than, say, some of the other equivalent professional choirs that we're often compared to. So there is a different sound. It's how to harness that younger sound, how to make it colorful, how to make it interesting, how to train it. It's a weird thing that the work is never done. I'm sure if I were to listen to this recording now, I might think, "Ooh, doesn't sound like that anymore, or maybe I wouldn't do something like that. But it's a work in progress. Right?
Yeah, and of course the choir is ever changing, both the front and the back rows. So you're always running to keep still in that sense as well.
Although that is true. Although interestingly, I do find that with children there is an element of sort of handing on, because we spend so much time working together in very detailed work in the song school, and you're teaching children not only how to use the voice that they've got, and you're developing that voice, you're also teaching them how to read and how to understand the emotive content of all the music. So it's a kind of additive process. By the time they get to their sort of penultimate and last years, they're sort of fully formed, and they do hand that down to the younger years. So there is a consistency which is part of the challenge.
Yes, I suppose if you're teaching very young singers, they're more of a blank slate in that sense. So they would a lot more of what goes into their musicianship will come from their older peers.
Yes, and with that comes, of course, because it's such a blank slate, arguably it comes with greater responsibility, because you're setting them up. I suppose what I see my job as doing is setting them up for a love of music that they would have for life. Some of them may go on to be professional musicians, but some of them might not, and they need to take away the best positive experience from all of this.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.